Our next composer, Arnold Bax, was born into a wealthy family in 1883. He grew up in Streatham, London, and it was whilst he was studying at the Royal Academy of Music that he became fascinated with Ireland and Celtic folklore. In fact, he even went to go and live in Dublin for a couple of years and adopted the pseudonym Dermot O'Byrne. He also composed poetry and composed a lot of music, and his interest in the viola was aroused whilst he was a student at the Royal Academy of Music. Bax was absolutely fascinated by Lionel Curtis, and so much so that he straight away decided to write a concert piece for Curtis, which is crammed with all sorts of different ideas, overflowing music with chromaticism and virtuosity, and that's what we'd like to play you a short excerpt of today. But he also wrote a lot of other pieces, including a brilliant sonata, a trio, which includes flute and harp, and the legend for viola and piano. I think you'll probably hear the Irish inspirations in his music. So whilst you're listening to this piece, imagine Dermot O'Byrne. Arthur Butterworth was born on the 4th of August 1923 in New Moston, Manchester, starting music as a choir boy, but it was the sound of the brass band in a park which fueled his lifelong musical passion. He started off learning trombone, but quickly moved on to the trumpet and the cornet. Butterworth actually is the first composer of our list today who studied at the Royal Northern College of Music. There he studied the trumpet and also composition. He began composing when he was only 10 years old, and he acknowledged that some of his first great influences were Vaughan Williams, Sibelius and Nielsen. He was actually really rather prolific, composing more than 150 works, including 7 symphonies, concertos and much more. Among his chamber works, the 2 piano trios are especially fine, but there are also sonatas for instruments with scant repertoire, such as the double bass and the heckelphone. His contribution to the viola repertoire includes a sonata, a concerto, a trio for cor anglais, viola and harp, and most latterly his pastoral, which is from 2002. That's the piece which we'll be playing today. Butterworth passed away in Empsey, North Yorkshire, in 2014.
I am delighted to introduce you to Martin Outram, Professor of Viola at the Royal Academy of Music, violist of the Maggini Quartet, and a guru of British viola music. Martin was also Timothy Riddard's teacher at the Royal Academy. He will be introducing you to four more composers: Alan Richardson, William Alwyn, Alan Rawsthorne, and Watson Forbes.
The Scottish pianist and composer Alan Richardson was born in Edinburgh in 1904 and died in London in 1978. In 1929 he came to London to study at the Royal Academy of Music, and there struck up a friendship with Watson Forbes, the violist, with whom he shared his harmony teacher Theodore Holland. Alan Richardson studied the piano with Harold Craxton, a famous teacher whose daughter Janet was to become an equally celebrated oboist, and who Alan was subsequently to marry. In 1949, Alan wrote a viola sonata dedicated to Watson Forbes and wrote, "This is to commemorate many happy occasions and 20 years' hard work. Let's look forward to the next 20 with the hope of spring eternal." They performed the piece for the first time that year, 1949, and broadcast it the following year for the BBC's Latin American service. Sadly, they only made one recording together. That was Richardson's beautiful little miniature Sussex Lullaby, but they performed his other miniatures, including Intrada and Autumn Sketches, many times over the years. William Alwyn was born in Northampton in 1905. His father was a greengrocer who ran a shop with the rather wonderful name of the Shakespeare Store. Apparently, if you bought your vegetables and your fruit there, you'd come away with them wrapped up in paper bags which had quotes from the bard printed on them. At that time, Northampton was regarded as the centre of the shoemaking industry in the UK, and it was from a local cobbler that the young William had lessons on the piccolo. At only 15, William was enrolled at the Royal Academy of Music and twice a week would travel down to London for lessons there. His early professional life was spent as a flautist in the London Symphony Orchestra, but he went on to develop an extremely varied career as a conductor, as a music administrator, as a professor himself at the Royal Academy of Music, teaching composition there. And of course, he was extremely widely known as a composer of symphonies, concertos, nearly 200 film and documentary scores, and a vast amount of chamber music. He played in a trio called the Celtic Trio with the viola player Watson Forbes and his pianist Alan Richardson, and they broadcast light music for the BBC. It was for Watson Forbes that he wrote several of his beautiful viola pieces. They're always extremely well crafted, very sensitive for the instrument. William Alwyn spent his final years living very close to Benjamin Britten along the coast in Suffolk. One of my favourite stories relates to the sonata by Alan Rawsthorne. I was introduced to this work by my teacher, John White, whose own teacher, the famous Scottish violist Watson Forbes, had himself been a crucial link in a quite remarkable story. The eminent violist Frederick Riddle had given the first performance of Rawsthorne's viola sonata in November 1937 in London. A critic requested a copy of the piano score from the composer to enable him to write his review. With the onset of war, the copy was put away for safekeeping. Rawsthorne himself transferred his own scores, similarly for safekeeping, to Bristol, including the viola part that went with his sonata. Unfortunately, that flat in which these scores were kept was itself bombed. Rawsthorne then forgot about the piece until 1953, when Watson Forbes found the manuscript piano part in a second-hand music shop in Hampstead, North London. It transpired that the composer had to go to the shop himself to negotiate a price to buy back his own viola sonata. After a few very small changes, it was published a year later. Rawsthorne must be one of the very few composers who, before studying music, began training as a dentist. His friend, the composer Constant Lambert, once humorously commented in a radio programme about Alan Rawsthorne's music that "the composer assures me that he has given up the practice of dentistry, even as a hobby. Watson Forbes is regarded as one of Scotland's most eminent viola players. He was born in 1909 in the small East Coast cathedral city of St Andrews, perhaps best known these days for its golf tournament and its university. He studied in London the violin with, amongst others, the famous player Albert Salmons, and in 1930 decided to further his studies in Czechoslovakia with the very famous pedagogue Otakar Shevchik. He returned to London and took up the viola, having lessons with a well-known chamber musician and freelance player Raymond Jeremy, himself a student of Lionel Curtis. Watson Forbes had some lessons with the great Curtis, but by his own admissions, these were, quote, not very successful. Nevertheless, he went on to carve out a very varied and versatile career, which spanned a long period. Initially, he played in West End theatre orchestras. He went on to be a member of the newly formed London Philharmonic Orchestra. He also played for a time in the London Symphony Orchestra, and during the war years was a member of the star-studded RAF Symphony Orchestra, whose members numbered some of the finest freelance players on the scene at the time. Alongside all these orchestral activities, he was well known as a member of several eminent chamber ensembles, not the least of which was the Stratton Quartet, which became the Aeolian Quartet in 1944. And as if that wasn't enough, he also is frequently heard as a solo player. Many new works were written specifically for him. He made some very, very fine recordings. The recording of the Bliss Sonata particularly comes to mind, a very difficult sonata. And in 1956, he was the soloist in the first performance of John Greenwood's new viola concerto at the Henry Wood Promenade concert. So all in all, he was extremely busy throughout his playing career and very, very widely known. As if that wasn't enough, he somehow managed to find time to make a huge number of arrangements for viola particularly, but not just viola, also violin and cello. And as an arranger, his name was literally known all over the world. In fact, when the great viola virtuoso William Primrose went to Japan to take up a teaching post, to his chagrin, he discovered that the name of Watson Forbes was far better known than his own. Forbes finished his working life as the head of music for BBC Scotland, a post which he took up in 1964. And so in his retirement, he really could look back on an extremely versatile, long career, leaving behind him a huge legacy.
Nicola Aronowitz, Cecil's wife, and 2 children, Sebastian and Tamsin, remember their husband and father.
He had a wonderful career. I don't know how he managed to fit it all in, but he belonged to many different chamber music groups, including the Melos Ensemble, which he co-founded. He was the 5th member of the Amadeus String Quartet whenever they played the quintet repertoire. He led the violas in the English Chamber Orchestra for many years, and also the London Mozart players. And in the late 1940s, he met Benjamin Britten for the first time. And from 1948 until his death, Cecil appeared at every single Alba festival. Benjamin Britten had a high regard for him, and just before his death, Benjamin Britten's death that is, he rewrote the Lacrimée for viola and orchestra, and he dedicated that to Cecil. The 1950s, 60s and 70s, up until his death in 1978, were the busiest decades in Cecil's career. He had, of course, lost 6 years during the course of the Second World War. He spent the war years in the army, but left music completely behind him. After the war, he returned to the Royal College of Music to complete his studies, and this is when he switched to the viola. As his performing career got underway, so did his teaching. He somehow managed to keep up many hours of teaching every week alongside all the performing and touring. His teaching career started at the Royal College of Music, where he was invited straight back to teach on leaving, finishing as a student in July, starting as a professor in September. He was a dedicated teacher, and as with everything he did, he threw himself wholeheartedly into it. He smoked heavily, not so unusual back then, and his teaching rooms famously were always a complete fog of smoke. Stories of him flicking ash into the F-holes are probably not true. More likely he would pick up his bow to demonstrate, forgetting to put his cigarette down, so ash would fly everywhere. In 1973, the Royal Northern College of Music was formed. John Mandel was its first principal, and he invited his old friend and colleague Cecil to be the first head of strings. This meant that Cecil was at last able to give up some of his hectic playing and touring life and lead a more settled existence, doing what he loved, teaching and helping students on their way. Cecil died in 1978 in hospital in Ipswich. He had been performing at St Maltings the evening before with colleagues from the second string quartet course, and in the middle of playing the Mozart string quintet in C, he collapsed on stage, falling onto his viola. So the last sounds he heard were those of Mozart, which I have always thought to be very appropriate.
Memories of music making at home are very vague, if there are any. I do kind of remember there being music stands brought out and musicians coming in, and there was always this really warm atmosphere. I mean, I remember that very clearly. The music making was often abroad, or certainly elsewhere. We've got all his diaries. When he was young, he wrote an enormous amount, which was his thoughts, He wrote a lot of stories about his own life, and he would give himself another name, but it was so obviously about him. I mean, I don't think he was trying to disguise it, but he was obviously thinking aloud on paper a lot.
As a young man, it would have been more memories. And then as he got older, it became professional diaries. So it was all his engagements and his, where he had to be, where he was rehearsing, where he was performing, who with. It's fascinating. But the strangest thing is that through every line in each diary, every time he did a task, he put a line through it.
Well, he put a scribble
through it. Or scribble through it to indicate that task had been done. And we found a diary from 1971 when I was born. And on February the 11th, 1971, daughter born, and then a scribble through it. I remember his stories. He was such a storyteller. And obviously a lot of stories that we've heard would have been told to us by other people. But we do remember a few, don't we?
We both remember very well, because he always used to pretend to eat it.
His viola.
His viola, yes.
Yeah, not the bow. He'd pretend to eat his viola.
So he would put the viola up to his mouth, and then he would get the bow, and I don't know what he did with it, but it would make the most horrendous sound. He would sort of twist it against the wood, I think.
Really, really horrible sounds, and he'd pretend to eat chunks out of the viola. And we loved it. Yeah. I mean, we really believed that's what he did. He ate his viola.
I had a job going door to door, knocking on people's doors and selling soap. I never made any money. Nobody ever bought anything from me. I was hopeless. And one day, it was raining, I think. And this guy opened the door, and I showed I had my ID card. And he looked at it and he said, "You're not Cecil Aronowitz's son, are you?" Which is what people always said. And then when you say yes, it's just, you always get the same look on people's faces. This just sort of joy spreads out from their face. And he invited me in and he made me tea and he bought all my soap.
We both have memories of, we think it was 1997, separately, but in the same season, going to Aldborough and St Maltings. And two of the Amadeus Quartet were in residence, coaching some of the string quartets. Who was there? It was Siggy Nissel and Norbert. I think it was just the two of them, wasn't it?
Yes. And
we went and introduced ourselves to the two members. And their reactions were just extraordinary to both of us. They, with Sebastian, I think even more so, because he looks so much like his father.
Yes, I went and sat with Darcy, my ex-wife. I just met her, actually, and I took her there, and we went and sat in on Siggy Nissel's class. And at the end, he turned round to me and Darcy, and he said, "Are you music students?" And I said, "Oh, no, I'm Cecil Aronowitz's son." And he looked like he'd seen a ghost. And he was just, totally... it was amazing. And then we went downstairs and we sat down and Norbert was there. And Norbert was telling me how excited he had been. He'd managed to buy one of Cecil's bows. And he was telling me all about that, how much it meant to him.
Cecil Solomon Aronowitz was born on the 4th of March 1916 in King Williamstown, South Africa, to Russian and Lithuanian parents. He began to play the piano when he was a boy, but very soon expressed a wish to learn the violin at his school, the Convent of the Sacred Heart. The idea of a Jewish boy at a convent is unusual enough, but as he told it, the Mother Superior said, "Well, Cecil, if you want to learn the violin, we must find a way of teaching you." So they sent off for a book on the subject, and one of the nuns was deputed to teach Cecil, 10 years of age at the time. This unorthodox training gave him a somewhat hunched playing posture which he never lost. From 1928 he was a pupil at the School of Music at Grahamstown Training College, and from 1933 he began studying in Durban with Sterling Robbins. In 1935, Cecil travelled to London on an overseas scholarship to further his studies with the Spanish-American pedagogue Achille Rivade at the Royal College of Music. And in 1937 he took up the viola as a second study with Ernest Tomlinson, a fine player who was a regular guest violist with the Bush Quartet. Rivade died in 1939, and Cecil's course of study was even more seriously interrupted by war service, latterly in the Intelligence Corps. When he returned to the Royal College in 1946, he felt unable to recapture his form as a violinist. So for £25 he bought the viola which he would use for the rest of his career, and his change of direction quickly brought recognition in the 1947 Cobbett Prize for Chamber Music. In 1948, Cecil started a 25-year stint of teaching at the Royal College and a 30-year collaboration with the Amadeus Quartet, one of the three great leitmotifs of his career. First violinist of the Amadeus Quartet, Norbert Breinen, said of Cecil, "When we started to play quintets at a very early date, we played with all sorts of people, very good players, but in the end we stuck with Cecil because in some way he suited us. He was very musical, and sometimes it felt as if he was a fifth member of the quartet." Second violinist, Sigmund Nissel, was even more definite about that. "We regarded Cecil as literally a fifth member of the Amadeus. He was extremely kind and a very good musician, although he refused to play on good instruments, and it was a joy to be in his company. I remember with particular pleasure the children's parties he gave for the children of the various musicians, especially at Christmas. He dressed up as Father Christmas." Norbert said of Cecil's viola, "It was a very ordinary instrument, and he was proud to tell you that his fiddle case cost more than his instrument." The various members of the Amadeus Quartet kept trading up until they were all playing on Strads or Del Jesus, but Cecil doggedly kept to his own viola, and even when he had to borrow an Amati because his instrument had come unglued, he did not like it. Nor did he really enjoy playing the Frank Bridge viola that Britain lent him. The point about his viola was that it worked for him, and he made a splendid sound on it. Various attributions were attached to it, and it still bears the label saying it was made by David Tekla in 1730. But the latest wisdom from Charles Beer is that it is mid-18th century French. A Cecil story concerning the Amadeus may be apocryphal, but I've asked all the survivors about it, and none of them has denied it. As you probably know, the Amadeus Quartet used to fight like cats and dogs in rehearsal. They were rehearsing with Aronowitz for a tour which would include some quintets, and things were getting a bit tense when the guest violist had the temerity to point out a slight flaw in one of his colleagues' playing. Whoever it was, and I suspect the late Peter Schidloff, rounded on him and exploded. "Why should you have anything to say? You play like a pig." Whereupon Cecil quietly got up, put his viola in its case, and left. A few days later, first violinist Norbert phoned him. "Cecil, about that tour?" Cecil's reply, "You don't want me to play, I play like a pig." "But my dear fellow, we all play like pigs. Now about that tour." In 1951, Cecil began teaching viola and coaching chamber music at William Gluck's Bryanston Summer School, which moved to Dartington in 1953, and with which he was involved for 20 years. From 1960 to 1962, he led the violas in Menuhin's Bath Festival Orchestra, and in 1963 he formed a duo with the pianist Nicola Grunberg, whom he married 4 years later. They had 2 children, Sebastian and Tamsin. Hugh Maguire recalls Cecil as the most wonderful viola player, always with a gorgeous sound and an incredibly busy man racing around helping people. I've been lucky enough to have Cecil's unique viola since the 27th of December 2003. It came to me via a set of rather tragic circumstances that go back all the way to 1978. Cecil Aronowitz collapsed on stage whilst playing Mozart's C major string quintet with students and staff from the Britton Piers School at Snape Maltings, Aldborough, on the 6th of September 1978. He never recovered and died in hospital the next day in Ipswich. His viola was terribly damaged as he collapsed, and for many years the broken instrument remained with Charles Beer, who lovingly pieced it back together again. It was in 1983 when Eric Rycroft, an ex-student of Cecil's, also a South African and a student who had studied with Cecil at the Royal College, approached Nicola Grunberg and asked if he could buy the repaired viola. He duly took possession of the instrument, travelled back to South Africa and adored playing on it for many years. It was in 2000 when Eric had a tragic motorbike accident and injured his left hand and arm, resulting in him no longer being able to play the viola. Eric was devastated and quickly sent the viola to his sister Anne Rycroft, who was at the time a violist in the London Philharmonic Orchestra. She very sadly passed away from cancer in November 2003, and unbelievably I called Eric on Christmas Day 2003 and he quickly said to me, "Louise, my viola is waiting for you in London. Go and get it." My dear friend Michael Fryan took me to fetch the viola that has undoubtedly changed my life on the 27th of December 2003. And well, the rest, as they say, is history. I was not quite sure how I might be able to continue the legacy of Cecil's viola the first few years after it came to me. My first idea was to write a book about Cecil and his incredible journey with his viola, but somehow this did not quite seem to be the right thing. It was over 10 years after acquiring Cecil's viola when I founded the Cecil Aronowitz International Viola Competition for violists aged 21 and under, launched at the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire. Thus far the competition has been held 3 times, 2014, 2017 and 2021. The next iteration is set for the 19th to 25th of January 2025. Timothy Ridout was the inaugural winner in 2014, aged 19, who has gone on to forge an international solo career, adding the accolade of becoming the first ever British winner of the Lionel Tertis International Viola Competition in 2016. In fact, the proof is in the pudding here. It is the sound of Timothy Ridout that is resonating across this documentary, telling the story of Cinderella no more.